even before, the 2019 moment of real awakening about the climate emergency, it was very apparent that in the Nova Scotia context, fracking could not take place safely. Folks are very proud of the fact that we were able to educate ourselves, stand up for clean, healthy water, stand up for what we do want.
The oil and gas industry, anytime it has a setback, it's just waiting for the chance to erase those. So the Trump administration, the Trump craziness, is the current opportunity. Even now, there's no pretending it's for our own energy security. Nobody pretends it's for Europe anymore. It's doubly ironic here in Nova Scotia because the government is using the tactics of the Trump chaos to flood the zone with all this stuff and overwhelm people. And the supposed reason for it is the Trump chaos.
Well, the oil and gas industry's response to Trump in Alberta is to try to build the Keystone XL oil pipeline to ship more oil to the U.S. Sorry, we're going to supply to people threatening us with more of the stuff.
We've spent our day and a half, I think, at a legislative committee this week, and it was very clear, as Ken said, that there is no, there's no support. Most of the presentations were very well versed in the impacts of fracking and very concerned.
Well, you had a rally in Halifax with over 500 people.
It's demonizing opponents. They don't have a plan. They don't pretend to have a plan. If the intent was to demonize and marginalize us, we're not marginalized. At the same time that they're throwing all this stuff out, they also tried to completely eliminate unscripted moments with the media.
Taking no out of Nova Scotia, like a time when Canadians should have the right to say no. It seems to be kind of fundamental to the whole existence of Canada, actually, the ability to say no.
People might think it's the not in my backyard phenomena, but the way Nova Scotians seem to take it to heart is that shouldn't be in anybody's backyard.
I think the strategic direction is self-sufficiency, is rapid deployment of renewable energy, self-reliance. We thought we'd be putting up wind turbines and solar panels and insulating houses, which is a better use of the government's time and resources.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Connor Curtis, Head of Communications with Sierra Club Canada, and today I'm going to be talking with Ken Summers and Gretchen Fitzgerald about the government of Nova Scotia under Premier Tim Houston attempting to enact authoritarian US-style measures such as limiting media access to elected leaders, giving the government the power to fire civil servants without cause, making it harder to find out what the government is up to via access to information requests, making it impossible to propose amendments at a government committee formerly called law amendments, lifting bans on fracking and uranium mining without consulting the Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chiefs, protections adopted after consultation and engagement with Nova Scotians and backed by health and economic research, I might add, and giving the government the power to appoint 50% of the Board of Governors of Nova Scotia universities and requiring universities to align their funding priorities with that of the government, a move that would constitute a threat to the independence of academic institutions in the province. The interview also comes after moves to enable the government to fire the Auditor General without cause and to hide the Auditor General's findings from the public were yanked recently. It's the same approach we're seeing in the United States itself to centralizing power and is reminiscent of the approach of the government in Alberta as well. But resistance to this approach in Nova Scotia is strong. Over 500 people subsequently joined a rally for democracy organized by various groups from labor organizations and unions to environmental groups, including Sierra Club Canada, that was held in Halifax to push back. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick, on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us. Ken, Gretchen, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having us, Connor.
Thanks. Thank you for having us.
For those tuning in who don't know who you are you and what do you do?
I'm Ken Summers. I live where the fracking happened in Nova Scotia. And not immediately, but a few years later, that's when I got involved with the anti-fracking campaign in Nova Scotia. So that's my background.
And when was that, for context? Like what year?
The fracking here actually happened in 2007 to 2009. And that was it for actual activity.
Okay.
It hit the news in Nova Scotia for the first time in 2011.
Okay. And Gretchen, people may be familiar with you, friend of the pod, but yeah, if you want to introduce yourself.
Definitely friend of the pod. So Gretchen Fitzgerald, I'm Executive Director of Sierra Club Canada Foundation. And Ken, I'm struck by how long ago that was, because I guess we've both been kind of doing this on and off for quite some time. So I was Atlantic Director at the time when the fracking hit the fan, shall we say.
But you were both there.
Yeah, in
Right.
Nova Scotia, and to some degree in the New Brunswick situation as well. So and as you know, Connor, there was a movement in Newfoundland and Labrador as well. So
I was part of that at the same time. Yeah.
And in PEI. So it was a regional, full-on, full-court press, shall we say, for all Atlantic Canada.
I remember interviewing somebody from New Brunswick talking about their situation at around the same time. So it was interesting how there was that talk. But that was a long time ago. I mean, for me, it's been over a decade now. Some stuff's been going on in Nova Scotia with the provincial government, potential resource extraction and fracking, but then also all this weird accountability, removal of checks and balances stuff, things like an attempt to get the ability to fire the Auditor General stopped now, making access to information requests harder, making it harder for citizens to access government, making it harder for media to access politicians. Lots of weird stuff. What's going on in Nova Scotia with the provincial government there?
Well, I guess we both have quite a bit to say on this, but honestly, it feels like rather than using this moment of global turmoil to really create security and self-sufficiency and frankly embrace some of the democratic processes that are being actively challenged by the U.S. administration. Unfortunately, we're seeing the Nova Scotia government attempt to mirror and use this moment, what some people view as a crisis, but it is a real moment of uncertainty, to do things that they did not come up in the last provincial election, and essentially to move ahead with things that Nova Scotians worked very hard to establish to protect clean water, protect the environment. So yeah, Ken, if you have a take on this, but in my history living in Nova Scotia, unprecedented.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I mean, yes, that's definitely true, is that as far as the fracking moratorium is part of a omnibus bill, basically about opening up for extraction without impediments, which is similar to the even bigger omnibus bills about the democracy issues. But as far as the fracking in particular, which understandably gets the most attention as far as this bill, historically, fracking, since we got the moratorium in 2015, early in the government's tenure, since we got it, fracking has become had become a third rail of Nova Scotia politics, to the point that when Tim Houston became premier, he moved from being the attack dog against the moratorium to the new premier in 2021 when questioned about the fracking moratorium, simply saying, we're done with that. That's been settled. No, there's not going to be any changes around that.
The issue was settled, or the feeling was that the issue was settled.
It was settled enough that he felt a need as the new premier to say, we're not going to bring that back. So that was then. And I guess they're gambling that now it's 10 years later and maybe they could rattle the cage a bit. They talk as if the line is that saying no is lazy public policy, which we've got across that much in the sort of public domain. It was anything but lazy public policy. There was a very thorough process here of discussing it, which is part of the reason nobody's wanted to go back there. But Houston and the government are gambling, I guess, that people just after a while they forget. It doesn't matter, whatever.
Yeah, and it's pretty shocking, like just given what Ken was alluding to, like there was broad public consultation, there was a report, numerous sort of sub-studies done under that Wheeler Commission report. It was quite an extensive process, and even before, the 2019 moment of real awakening about the climate emergency, it was very apparent that in the Nova Scotia context, fracking could not take place safely. And I think in a way, folks are very proud of the fact that we were able to educate ourselves, stand up for clean, healthy water, stand up for what we do want. And it is such a betrayal to a lot of the things that we've said we are going to do as a society. And yeah, that's almost what is the most shocking about this moment is, you're reminding me, Ken, like, that it's not like this was not known, like this was well known by people in power who are still in power now. So yeah, it's really shocking.
And who's this fracking for? Because it's a similar thing in Newfoundland and Labrador, right? Like we had a lot, I think there's a lot of pride still in being able to stand up for local communities and, really a community-led movement that happened. I don't think anybody there at the time expected was going to happen, but it happened. Who's the fracking for? Because you keep seeing things from Europe saying there isn't going to be a market for LNG there. And that's where, as I understood it, most of the LNG development was based on this kind of faulty idea that you were going to supply Europe. Then Repsol scraps its plans because it says actually there's no business case there. And they had the best business case of anybody, and they couldn't find a business case in Europe. So who's this for? Who's the consumer for this fracking?
Well, the current iteration is, in what we now know, partly in hindsight, is the oil and gas industry. Anytime it has a setback, it's just waiting for the chance to erase those. So the Trump administration, the Trump craziness, is the current opportunity in a very bizarre way, but that's what it is. In a climate of uncertainty, let's hop on people's fears about whether there's going to be energy security or jobs or whatever it is, throw it all at the wall. And that's basically apparently early today, I didn't hear it directly, big assault by the oil, the energy companies and the pipeline companies working together. In terms of who is the gas for, it's to sell it, Even now, there's no pretending it's for our own energy security. There is passing statement that why should we be using foreign oil and when we have Canadian oil available? That's not even gas, but nobody pretends it's for Europe anymore. It's just basically playing on people's insecurity, attempting to play on people's insecurity. It's doubly ironic here in Nova Scotia because the government is using the tactics of the Trump chaos to flood the zone with all this stuff and overwhelm people. And the supposed reason for it is the Trump chaos and what this is going to do to us. This is our response to Trump. We have to we have to provide for ourselves better, and providing for ourselves means having more jobs here and tracking these jobs. And it's not carefully laid out, but that's basically what the messaging is.
Well, the oil and gas industry's response to Trump in Alberta is to try to build the Keystone XL oil pipeline to ship more oil to the U.S.
Yeah.
So, there's like this kind of like, sorry, we're going to supply to people threatening us with more of the stuff, and that's the plan. Like that's just it because as you say, if Europe isn't going to be the source for this, if it's not really a domestic issue, then it's like what was the plan here, or is it, as you say, just flooding the zone? I don't know, if Gretchen, if you have thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think they have used some terminology and some of their messaging. I'll have to go back. This was a lot of this was conveyed to Nova Scotians for people outside of Nova Scotia in a long letter that was on the cover of our paper of record, the Chronicle Herald, and other papers from the premier saying we have to do this. We have to take the no out of Nova Scotia was the phrase. And I think some of the phrasing or the words used there was about, some way that this would help with energy security. So yeah, maybe they think there is a local use for it. But I think mostly if folks are familiar with the phrase shock doctrine, it's about using a moment of crises, like Ken alluded to kind of maybe get things done that people who are actually able to think beyond the anxiety that we're all feeling, like, would be like, no, that is not a sensible economic plan. So yeah, I think it is a bit of using a moment of crisis to perhaps do some things that maybe they think is to give them some, maybe they do genuinely think this is in the best interest of Nova Scotians, but definitely are not democratically supported. And that was, we've spent a day and a half, I think, at a legislative committee this week, and it was very clear, as Ken said, that there is no, there's no support, like maybe from certain sectors like the mining association, but like wide scale, most of the presentations were very well versed in the impacts of fracking and very concerned. So yeah.
And I was just going to say, like, it comes at a time when you said taking no out of Nova Scotia, like a time when Canadians should have the right to say no. Like it seems to be kind of fundamental to the whole existence of Canada, actually, the ability to say no.
Yeah.
It's a weird branding.
Part of it is it's demonizing opponents. They don't have a plan. They don't pretend to have a plan. It's when we roll something out, these special interests, which they have labeled us all as, are going to be out there to stop this. That's all they ever say is no. The themes we've heard lots before, only amped up to a great degree, and we can at least say they haven't been successful in this.
Yeah.
If the intent was to demonize and marginalize us, we're not marginalized.
No. I mean, Connor, on this podcast and others, other educational materials you've been providing to our supporters, you talk a lot about misinformation, and unfortunately, part of how misinformation works is someone has heard a message first before they've heard the counter message or what turns into the counter message in response. So I'm not totally dismissive of what they've done here. I think it is a very cleverly constructed campaign and frame. And it, you people have already put someone in a box of being a certain thing. And then if there actually is a fracking project proposed, or God forbid, uranium mining proposed, or if we want to have a pulp mill that's going to drain what remains of our intact forests from the landscape, then they've already, at least it's been attempted. They already have an image of what the champions of the environment are. And I mean, I think why, and I hope it will fail, that's where I agree, Ken, is that in Nova Scotia, the champions of the environment often come from the communities impacted. It's not some, one of the most yucky questions I saw at public bills, formerly law amendments, was, where does your money come from? Like trying to use these specious arguments that have nothing to do with the issues at hand, but again, trying to put people in a frame of the other rather than people acting out of the best interests of communities. And that's, again, replicating othering tactics we've seen in the US administration is a very dangerous thing, but it does work. Let's not be naive. It does work. So I think like working to get the message out and to have voices like Ken. And I mean, Ken, I was really struck watching your presentation about what you experienced, and I don't know when fracking was taking place. And I do think people need to be reminded of what this industry entails on like the landscape, and as when you turned around a corner and saw it happening. And I was wondering if you could walk us through that, like that you described to the legislative committee this week, because it was a good reminder to me, but for folks who weren't around back in the day, I do think this is the type of thing that needs to be forefronted. And I think when New Brunswick tried to open up fracking, bringing those voices forward was really, really important. Talk a bit about what went down in Kennecott and how you found out fracking. How was it happening? Like, how did you even know?
As would happen in a lot of rural places, we don't have any background with any of this. Somebody comes in and has a couple open houses, and I happen to know something about the oil and gas industry, but what they were talking about was definitely I even knew what hydraulic fracturing was, but I knew what they were talking about was different. Fracking shale gas at the front end, basically, instead of using hydraulic fracturing to get the last little bit out of reservoir, this is fracking at the beginning and all the way through to get the hydrocarbons out. So mystifying to me. And then they came and they did their thing. See drilling rigs around. I'm one of the few people who probably drove up to one of the fracking sites when they happened, and it was mind-boggling. Which then find out later these are small fracks, mind-boggling enough. All the machinery around that I didn't even see a waste pond, which after it was all gone, and later on find out the waste ponds are still there, come back to look, they're huge. And I didn't see it because there's so much stuff going on all around. At any rate, it was gone. And then we find out later, basically what nobody told us, that if it had ever happened, shale gas fracking is a very intensive hit to a rural landscape. The way I often describe it to people is, you know what a refinery looks like? Mm-hmm. Or take a refinery and then take it to a rural place where I live, like say you have 15 kilometers by 5 kilometers where a few hundred people live, and you take the refinery and spread it out over that whole area. That's what we live in. If that's what, now we didn't get that, but nobody mentioned to us that this is what, in fact, we had to find out by combing through thousands of pages of documents, literally, to find a little map, which then once we saw the map, we go looking for the references to it. And this is an indication from the oil company. If it's successful, this is what it looks like. In their model, there was 50 wells on 10 well pads, pipelines and everything running around in exactly this area, which is relatively settled, where several hundred people live. Also, you need to realize that this was happening here when fracking in Pennsylvania was new. We'd barely heard about it in Pennsylvania. They were only into their first couple thousand wells. By the time we hear what it would have been like if it had gone ahead, it is happening in Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. There are thousands and thousands of wells, and if you live in any particular area, there are hundreds and hundreds in your immediate vicinity. It's like living in an industrial landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the waste ponds, which is just a
Yeah, we'll talk
story in
about
it.
the waste ponds, Ken. I
Yeah.
mean, it's just,
I mean,
yeah,
and this
just
and
talk about
and
what happened there with the water
yeah,
and the waste
and the waste
ponds.
ponds actually became the concrete thing that people saw the most around Nova Scotia. But just to by way of context, most of us, except the waste ponds are in the woods, and except for immediate neighbors who would drive up these wood roads, most of us had no idea they were there. And these are communities where everybody knows everybody's business, you
Yeah,
know, and we don't know the
As
waste
well.
ponds are there, you know,
there's like,
and until I found them literally in these thousands of pages of documents. It document says waste pond's still there. Oh, who knew? And I drive up there.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Oh, yes, it's huge. And I was here before, but I didn't see it. And that's where the saga in public really begins, because this is where the government got exposed for its lack of preparation. Because here are these big waste ponds of fracking wastewater, which they'd actually been siphoning off into the Windsor nearby town sewage treatment plant, which is the same thing they did in Pennsylvania in the beginning. Municipal treatment plants, they're just totally not suited for the purpose, which once the government started feeling scrutiny, they stopped that practice from happening. And then we had a 3-year circus unfold of, well, what are we going to do about it? But the bottom line is that absolutely no preparation what to do about it. And a good kind of connection back to the public process that Gretchen was talking about, which was the Wheeler Commission, is the end recommendation. The Wheeler Commission was not anti-fracking. They did recommend a moratorium, but they also said use the time to develop policy and regulations. And absolutely nothing has happened here. Not a look into it. It just disappeared. In fact, the departments that dealt with it themselves disappeared. You know, there's nobody to turn on the lights anymore, even, and they're talking about bringing back the possibility of fracking. And just as an example of what a challenge this is, Alberta, I may not like what the oil and gas industry does. I may not support them, but Alberta has as good regulations of the oil and gas industry as come. They're a model for what they do. You know, they don't do lots of things, but what they do, including they have tight regulations of what you do with fracking wastewater. But they're for regulations for an infrastructure system that exists for handling the wastewater. So, what happens in areas that are new? Pennsylvania was like that. In Pennsylvania, they had a few thousand wells. They were starting into their second 10,000s of wells. And still, all this is going through municipal treatment plants and then into rivers. Now, rivers in Pennsylvania are gigantic by Nova Scotia standards. That's not even a possibility here. So basically, they're dumping it in Pennsylvania where they can. The only place it could be dumped here, if you don't have a system already, is into the ocean. That's realistically what would have to happen here until they build. So for example, there's no analysis of where does that infrastructure come from. They didn't have it in New Brunswick either. In fact, what wastes in New Brunswick, the only one large frac that happened in the Maritimes happened in New Brunswick, and the wastes came here to Windsor, Nova Scotia, which basically was the first municipality they could find that would take the stuff.
And Ken, I don't even know through that whole saga if it was it ever revealed what was in there? I mean, I've since read a pretty recent report that in Colorado, the Physicians for Social Responsibility have figured out they were using PFAS, which are like forever chemicals, which there's no way to remediate for. Like, you know, and they only found it out through, of course, investigation. It's not like it was up on some website somewhere. Did we ever find out what was in those ponds?
No,
And
and the cleanup happened so much later
yeah,
that we don't know what was in the wastewater.
yeah,
Highly diluted by the time we're talking about years of rainwater
later
falling on
rainwater
top of it.
and
Um,
discharge, like you
the
say,
biggest
into
thing
other
we don't,
places.
the
Yeah.
naturally occurring radiation material norms is a big factor in all fracking wastewater because there's lots of radiation, not just where uranium is mined, that stays a few thousand meters down in the ground where it's not a hazard to us. But fracking brings it up to the surface.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now that off gases fairly quickly. So by the time anybody bothered to test anything here, that was all gone.
Mm-hmm.
All the
Mm-hmm.
norms would have dissipated into the atmosphere. After the fact, that's the one thing Nova Scotia has now. They do have standards of what wastewater treatment has to meet, but we've never actually done that. And we don't have
Yeah.
the infrastructure to do it, and nor does New Brunswick. New Brunswick, as long as they could, sent it here, as long as they could get away with that. So,
Yeah. And you'd mentioned Dr. Wheeler and the Wheeler Commission, and he was actually interviewed recently because of this has come up again. And unfortunately, he does still engage a little bit in this magical thinking that somehow all of this waste and health impacts and impacts on the landscape and so forth can be managed. I felt that was sort of the tone of his interview, but he did say now with the climate crisis, it's pretty clear we can't have more fossil fuels. So it's interesting. Like, I think even his opinion, like you say, it wasn't like the results of that commission were unequivocally anti-fracking. It was more, I think, the movement and the awareness that, and frankly, I think your experience down there was, what are we doing here? Like, do we even, you call them Keystone Cops in your
yeah.
submission this week. Like, do we even have the capacity in any way to manage something as dangerous as this?
I
It's,
think people around here were open to it.
uh,
But basically after they heard and watched the performance, it's like, no, this
yeah,
is nuts. Which is why, I mean, that's one of the ironic things. By the time the campaign had finished, the climate had turned against fracking happening across Nova Scotia. It's kind of interesting because people might think it's the not in my backyard phenomena, but the way Nova Scotians seem to take it to heart is that shouldn't be in anybody's backyard. I'm
yeah,
just not.
Well, that's the thing I remember in Newfoundland and Labrador too. It wasn't like it was just a bunch of local communities who were like, nobody should have to do this. I mean, I remember some people
yeah,
came over from Alberta and talked about fracking in their backyard and how it was affecting them, and they wanted us to be aware. It wasn't about like putting it on somebody else. It was like, you need to be aware of what happens if this
Yeah,
comes to your community. It was an incredible actually thing of solidarity, and it does talking about brings back something else that when we're talking about these quote unquote special interest groups, in the case of fracking, it really is just people in communities who educated themselves, informed themselves, organized themselves, and then reached out to other communities and lots of other places to try and help them too. Because you talked about putting people in boxes, right? And that sort of attempt. And that is something we're seeing in the US, sometimes literally putting people in boxes for their opinions. It's not just an attempt to fast track resource projects, but then there's also this, again, US style, it seems removing any accountability measures from government. I just wanted to, if you could chat a little bit about the context of how this fits into those larger things that you're seeing happen, those other concerning measures.
the three of us seem to have missed, and Pat tells me about early today, is an ad campaign in every newspaper in Canada, and it's been broadcast clips on CBC. Sounds like a full court press by the oil companies and the pipelines saying, we have to do this. This is urgent. This is the national interest and all that kind of thing. And it's all part of the same thing of using the opportunity that they haven't dared for several years. Basically, they've never lost, but they've been on the backside of momentum. The momentum has not been in their favor. And God, are they ready to jump on the opportunity to turn the tables? So you have that on the national level which is much more overt and overwhelming. And then we have it here in Nova Scotia, where the like-minded premier and his government are quite into using that in its local form.
I mean, I think what we're doing here is the solution is speaking to your neighbors, showing up for each other. I mean, that's IRL in real life can sometimes short circuit some of these very fancy and miscommunications, misinformation campaigns. So I think keep on doing that. And that's one of the strengths, obviously, in Atlantic Canada, but in all of Canada, really. We do have these communities and connections that can diffuse some of the attempts to put other certain members of the community. And I think we just have to keep on keeping on. I actually was shocked. This is not honest, I was really shocked that this was the response to what's happening in the United States, because I don't think it's strategic either. I think the strategic direction is self-sufficiency, is rapid deployment of renewable energy, self-reliance. It's actually the inverse of, and we haven't even talked about uranium. Just anyway, talk about managing waste in perpetuity. Anyway, just bonkers in a province like Nova Scotia, which is, so small and has so much precipitation, and water is one of the main ways the contamination from uranium mining gets spread around. I am actually flummoxed as to what the end game. I mean, it's pretty obvious what the end game is, but why they think will be successful politically for them, I am actually flummoxed. And I think it's a huge mistake, because I think there's so much potential here for shifting to what we embrace, which is energy democracy, control over energy systems that are clean and scalable and can be, fracking, uranium. That's not going to be deployed in the next in response to this current moment, whereas you could get wind turbines and solar panels up, in a matter of years, maybe even months. So, yeah. I mean, offshore wind is a bigger investment and would take longer, but you know what I mean? There's things that we could be doing to make ourselves self-sufficient, and this is just the opposite. I mean, I will say we are familiar with this happening in Nova Scotia. This happened after the Biodiversity Act was proposed, and there was sort of a campaign from Forest Nova Scotia to kind of make people who want a protection of biodiversity to seem like anti-Nova Scotian, and that one actually succeeded. And I believe one of the people involved in that is now advising the premier. So I think we know the playbook. I think maybe perhaps there's so much awareness here of uranium and fracking that it's maybe not. And frankly, the moves to remove the Auditor General or be able to fire the Auditor General without cause and withhold reports of the Auditor General was just so flagrantly a bridge too far that there was pushback. And there's enough access to our democratically elected leaders here that they feel that pushback. So again, I am flummoxed as to what their long game is, or why they think this will be successful, or even popular. But yeah, definitely the playbook is quite familiar. And I just feel we just need to keep, like I say, campaigning and as much as possible doing stuff in real life with our neighbors and communities. Because in settings where people are, I would love for some of these MLAs to have a town hall on this, because I don't think they would be very popular. And I would challenge them to do that. I don't think any of them has. They're too busy trying to get these things passed before anybody knows what's going on.
Well, you had a rally in Halifax with over 500 people, which is a big crowd for a city size of Halifax, right?
A weekday Wednesday, pretty good, and 500 to 600 people, and yeah.
So how did it go?
It was really powerful, I have to say. The speakers were incredibly powerful, and there is, like Ken alluded to, there's a wide range of bills, like the part of this omnibus bill, affecting our, universities are extremely important to culture and the economy of Nova Scotia. So they're trying to have more control over what universities are getting up to, and have 50% of the seats on their boards, and somehow determine sort of the direction of the things that are, we don't know, communicated or researched at universities. There's everything from soup to nuts on the table here right now. There's the Auditor General, there's fracking, there's uranium. Anyway, so it was very powerful to hear from different parts of the community, from labor to environment to the Mi'kmaq speakers, about how this is a challenge to their rights. So yeah, I think it was very powerful. The premier didn't come out and speak to us. So, and in fact, I think he was having a press conference about something else at the same time. So I guess I think there's definitely some strategy going on to try to diminish the voices of people that are opposing what they're doing. But yeah, I mean, I think it was a great turnout, and definitely the sense of community again was palpable. And I think it reassured people that we're going to show up and we're going to stop these bad ideas.
It's a reasonable hope that the government has been too clever by now, that the whole idea of the Trump chaos thing is to flood the zone. You throw a load of stuff out there, and then basically you don't have to win everything. It's all, it's just overwhelming. Well, when the fracking moratorium came up to the law amendments public review 10, 11 years ago, we had a few people turn out to give testimony. This Bill 6 this time, we had a couple dozen people just for Bill 6, about fracking uranium, plus all the other bills. And it seems to have had the opposite synergistic effect. The government has stirred up more opposition. So that remains to be seen, but so far it definitely hasn't been a big success. That's not to say they can't win this in the end, but it's not been some smashing success for them.
Mm-hmm. It's made a way for people to connect the dots. I mean, we had a really great speaker from the Donkin coal mine, and he was able to show the lack of accountability to the noise that they experience from that mine, and that mine is second worst methane polluter that we know of, because we're not really sure in the province, even though it's not even operational right now. That might be leaking methane for decades. Definitely other parts of Nova Scotia, including the Mi'kmaq chiefs and grassroots activists are completely activated now. So there'll be other ways, aside from a vote in the legislature, to and other levels of government we can work with. But
it looks like they're testing what they can get away with. So, for example,
in the U.S.
So for example,
the edges
at the
of the
same
frame.
time
how far is the window moved? The Overton window.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So at the same time that they're throwing all this stuff out, they also tried to completely eliminate unscripted moments with the media. That didn't really work. They had to back away from that. One of the obvious ways it doesn't work is if you don't talk to the media just only has your opponents to talk to.
Yeah,
Well,
because we're out-resourced, obviously, by opponents such as the mining industry and the oil and gas industry. But what we do have is a lot of community grassroots power, for sure.
Well, I was going to say we are seeing this nationally. There's new polling out just the other day, actually, that looked at, as of March 2025, still 65% of people want to see renewable energy development instead of oil and gas. And so just as like a kind of a closing statement, how can people find out more and get involved?
It's relevant to point out that this has come so long after that we still know all each other. We can jump into action pretty fast, but we haven't done anything for years, So, and all of a sudden we're supposed to do everything, So we're scrambling to get our website, get back, but we'll have that very soon. But that's worth noting. I mean, this is so remote that most of us figured we were never going to be back here doing this kind of stuff again. And here we are.
Yeah, we thought we'd be putting up wind turbines and solar panels and insulating houses, which is a better use of the government's time and resources. But yeah, I mean, I guess definitely, in terms of calling the premier's office, we heard from someone on the no frack list that they did get a call back. So that's interesting. So it's still really valid, even if you may feel you're not going to convince people. It's really valid that they hear that you do not consent to these things. Like, I do not consent, and you do not, I do not support what you are doing. Because I think even when I was presenting and you could tell you probably aren't going to change their votes, but talking to them about the facts makes them a little less sure that they should proceed. And if that in the long game changes things or makes it less likely that, a company coming here will feel welcome, all of these things are really important. So yeah, calling your MLA, calling your municipal leaders. We didn't even mention the fact that a letter went to municipal leaders, municipalities, asking for them to support lifting the ban on fracking and uranium mining. So definitely calling municipal, because, as Ken mentioned, their waste systems might be left holding the bag ultimately for this stuff, or they'll be charged with shipping in fresh drinking water that's safe if the drinking water for people's wells gets contaminated. Calling your municipal leaders as well is really important. And I think also like talking to people about what the real impacts are and facts and so forth that will be up on the NoFac website once it's up, but on our website, on the Ecology Action Center's website, just getting facts out there about the volume of, what are the impacts so that people can speak about it realistically and know where it's potentially going to happen. That's one of the questions I get most, actually, is where is it going to happen? So anyway, we got to get all that information out there, spreading that information so that we can counter what's coming from the oil and gas industry is important. Sorry, Ken, I don't know if you have.
One of the feedbacks that we get is that sustained calling of Premier's office, not so much municipal councillors, they don't deserve to get sustained, but to definitely the Premier's office, the MLAs, that we keep calling them. It's not just right now in this moment, even after they presumably pass this legislation, likely next week. We have, that's one of the things the government likes doing is off balance. It could be next week, it could be tomorrow,
Yeah,
it could be a month from now.
Yeah,
but whenever they pass the legislation, that's not the end of it, because we just have to keep making sure that this is not with our consent.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, we will put any links to anything that is up below the podcast, so please do check that out if you're listening in. And once again, Gretchen, Ken, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks so much, Connor.
Thanks for having us.
Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.